Have you ever met someone so arrogant that, within just 10 minutes, they made you question how they had ever become successful in the first place? I have. I walked into what I thought was going to be a career-changing interview. I walked out wondering if I'd just met the most disrespectful CEO on the planet. He wasted my time, insulted my experience, and treated me like I wasn't even worth preparing for. Years later, I found a way to get the smallest, pettiest revenge imaginable. It didn't cost me a single dollar. It wasn't illegal, and exactly 7 days later, his company's Wikipedia page disappeared forever. Here's how it happened. Before we jump in, if you've ever dealt with a terrible boss, an arrogant manager, or someone who thought they were untouchable, make sure to like this video and subscribe. These stories remind us that sometimes karma doesn't arrive with fireworks, it shows up quietly when people least expect it. Now let's get into today's Reddit revenge story. The whole thing started with what I thought was a promising opportunity. A few years ago, I was actively looking for a new job. I'd polished my resume, spent evenings researching companies, and practiced answering every interview question I could think of. Like anyone searching for work, I knew interviews weren't just about proving my skills, they were about proving that I was worth someone's time. So when a small but growing company reached out and invited me to interview with the CEO himself, I took it as a good sign. Meeting directly with the CEO, I thought, maybe this company really values its people. I couldn't have been more wrong. The interview was scheduled for early in the morning. I arrived about 15 minutes ahead of time, wearing my best suit and carrying a neatly organized folder with extra copies of my resume, references, and portfolio. I wanted to make a professional first impression. The receptionist greeted me politely and asked me to take a seat. No problem, I smiled. I'm a little early anyway. 5 minutes passed, then 10. 20, I glanced around the lobby. Employees hurried past with coffee cups and laptops, barely acknowledging me. Every few minutes I looked toward the hallway, expecting someone to call my name. Nothing. After 30 minutes, I politely asked the receptionist if everything was still on schedule. She gave me an apologetic smile. He's running a little behind. A little behind. I nodded and sat back down. What else could I do? By the 45-minute mark, my confidence had started turning into embarrassment. I wondered if I'd somehow written down the wrong time. I checked the confirmation email. Nope, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. An hour after my scheduled interview time, the CEO finally appeared. There was no apology, no handshake. Not even a simple "thanks for waiting." Instead, he walked past me as if I were interrupting his day. "You coming?" he asked without even making eye contact. That should have been my first clue to leave. Instead, I followed him into his office, still trying to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe he'd had an emergency. Maybe an important client meeting had run long. Maybe he'd at least acknowledge the delay once we sat down. He didn't. His office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who loved the sound of his own success. Awards lined the shelves, framed magazine mentions hung on the walls. There were oversized photos of him shaking hands with local politicians and business leaders, carefully positioned so anyone sitting across from his desk couldn't miss them. He motioned toward a chair without saying a word. Then, for the first time, he looked at the papers in front of him. My resume, still crisp, still perfectly stacked, still completely unread. He flipped through the first page with the kind of disinterest someone might show while skimming junk mail. "So," he said slowly, "tell me what you do." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. Everything he needed to know was sitting right in front of him: years of experience, relevant projects, professional accomplishments, skills that matched the position he'd advertised. None of it seemed to matter. As the interview continued, it became painfully obvious he'd done absolutely no preparation. Every question felt random, disconnected, almost like he'd forgotten which position I was applying for. Then things became even stranger. Instead of asking about my qualifications, he started asking about people I'd worked with before. "What was your former manager really like? Who actually made the important decisions over there? Do you still keep in touch with anyone?" The questions weren't about me anymore. They were fishing expeditions. It felt less like a job interview and more like he was trying to gather gossip about another company. Inside my head, alarm bells were ringing. This isn't normal. This isn't professional, and this definitely isn't someone I want to work for. But the worst part wasn't the questions, it was the attitude behind them. Every answer I gave was met with an impatient sigh, a dismissive shrug, or another interruption before I'd even finished speaking. He wasn't listening. He was waiting for his turn to talk. By that point, I realized something that completely changed the way I saw the situation. I wasn't interviewing for this company anymore. I was interviewing them, and they were failing spectacularly. The realization hit me all at once. I wasn't sitting across from a demanding leader with high standards. I was sitting across from someone who genuinely believed other people's time had no value. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying me for the first time as if he were finally deciding whether I was worth paying attention to. So, he said, why are you leaving your current company? It was a fair question, I answered honestly. I explained that I was looking for new challenges, more opportunities for growth, and a healthier long-term environment. I kept my response professional because that's what interviews are supposed to be, professional conversations. He smirked. That's the answer everyone gives. Before I could respond, he interrupted again. No, tell me the real reason. For a split second, I wondered if he was trying to test my honesty. Then it became obvious he wasn't interested in the truth. He wanted gossip. He started naming people from my previous workplace. What was your manager actually like? Who really controlled the projects? Did anyone there have financial problems? Who was difficult to work with? The questions kept getting more personal and less relevant to the role I'd applied for. I answered politely at first. I'm sorry, but I don't feel comfortable discussing former coworkers. He frowned. You don't have to protect them anymore. That sentence stuck with me. Not because it was aggressive, because it revealed exactly who he was. If he expected me to betray people I'd worked with before, what would he expect me to say about his own employees someday? Trust clearly wasn't something he valued. Loyalty certainly wasn't. The interview had only lasted a few minutes, yet I already knew more about his character than any company website could ever tell me. He flipped through my resume again. So, explain this gap. I looked at the page. There isn't a gap. He frowned harder. This right here. I pointed to the dates. That's when I changed positions within the same company. Oh, no apology, no acknowledgement that he'd misread it, just another page turn. At that moment, I realized something almost funny. He hadn't just failed to read my resume before the interview. He wasn't even reading it during the interview. Every question he asked had already been answered on the page sitting in his hands. I started wondering how many candidates he'd treated exactly the same way. How many people had walked through those doors excited about an opportunity, only to leave questioning whether they'd somehow done something wrong. Then he asked another question. So what salary are you expecting? I gave him a reasonable range based on the position, my experience, and the local market. He actually laughed, not a polite chuckle, an honest-to-goodness laugh. You're pretty confident, I smiled politely. I believe it's a fair market rate. He shook his head. Younger professionals always think they're worth more than they are. There it was. The final straw, it wasn't really about the money, it was the disrespect, the assumption that my experience meant nothing, that preparing for the interview meant nothing, that waiting over an hour without a single apology meant nothing. I suddenly became very calm. Funny enough, that's usually when I know I've made a decision. I closed the folder I'd brought with me. He looked up. What are you doing? I stood. I think we're done here. For the first time since I'd entered his office, he looked surprised. What do you mean? I don't think this is the right fit. His expression shifted from confusion to irritation. You've only been in here 10 minutes. Exactly. I'd waited over an hour to be treated with disrespect for 10 minutes. I extended my hand anyway. Thank you for your time. He didn't shake it. Instead, he simply stared at me as if he couldn't believe someone would walk away from him. I lowered my hand, turned toward the door, and left without another word. As I walked through the lobby, I felt something unexpected. Not disappointment, relief. Outside, I took one deep breath of fresh air. The interview hadn't cost me a job, it had saved me from one. At the time, I figured that was the end of the story. I'd never have to think about that CEO again. I had no idea that years later, a completely random discovery on the internet would hand me the perfect opportunity for the smallest, pettiest, and somehow most satisfying revenge imaginable. Life moved on. I found another job. Ironically, it turned out to be everything that interview hadn't been. My new manager respected people's time. My coworkers actually enjoyed coming to work. Meetings started when they were supposed to, and people listened when someone else was speaking. It wasn't a perfect workplace, but it reminded me that decent leadership wasn't some impossible dream. Every once in a while, though, that interview would pop back into my mind, usually when someone complained about a bad boss. I'd tell the story, everyone would shake their heads, and we'd all laugh about the CEO who couldn't be bothered to read a resume before interviewing someone. Eventually, it became one of those memories you assume you'll never revisit, until one evening. I was browsing online after work, reading career advice and job reviews when I stumbled across a website I'd somehow never used before, Glassdoor. Curious, I started looking up companies I'd interviewed with over the years. Some reviews were positive, some were mixed. Then I remembered that asterisk company. Out of pure curiosity, I typed its name into the search bar. The page loaded. I expected a handful of negative comments. maybe one or two people complaining about management. Instead, it felt like I'd opened a time capsule filled with stories almost identical to mine. One former employee described the CEO as arrogant and dismissive. Another said interviews felt like interrogations rather than conversations. Someone else wrote that the company had terrible turnover because nobody wanted to work under him for long. There were complaints about disrespect, micromanagement, favoritism, constant ego. The more I scrolled, the more one thought echoed in my head. So it wasn't just me. That realization was strangely comforting. For years, a tiny part of me had wondered whether I'd caught him on an unusually bad day. Maybe he'd been stressed. Maybe I'd judged him too harshly. Those reviews erased every doubt. This wasn't an accident, it was a pattern. Dozens of people had walked away with the same impression I had after those miserable 10 minutes. I leaned back in my chair, almost laughing. The interview hadn't been personal. He treated everyone that way. Then curiosity pulled me one step further. I searched for the company itself. Their official website appeared first, nothing surprising there. Then I noticed something else, a Wikipedia page. That's odd, I thought. This wasn't some global corporation. It wasn't a household name, it was a relatively small company. Still, I clicked. The article immediately felt off. If you've ever spent time reading Wikipedia, you know the style is usually dry, neutral, and packed with citations. This wasn't like that. The opening paragraph practically sounded like an advertisement. It praised the company's innovation, its visionary leadership, its industry-changing impact. Every sentence seemed carefully written to make the business sound far more important than it actually was. I couldn't help smiling. This has to be self-written. The longer I looked, the more obvious it became. I clicked over to the article's edit history. Sure enough, there had been constant arguments between editors. Someone would remove promotional language. A few days later, it would mysteriously come back. Another editor would delete unsupported claims, someone else would restore them. Back and forth. Over and over. Eventually, the volunteers who maintained Wikipedia had stripped away nearly all of the marketing fluff. What remained was almost comical. Just a few plain sentences that basically said, "This company exists." That was it. No glowing praise, no exaggerated achievements, no grand legacy, just the bare minimum. Even better, a bright banner sat at the top of the page. It questioned whether the company was even notable enough to deserve a Wikipedia article at all. The message explained that the article lacked significant independent sources and might not meet Wikipedia's standards for inclusion. Reading that banner triggered a memory: the CEO's office. The oversized awards, the framed newspaper clippings, the carefully curated image of success. Everything about him screamed that he wanted recognition. He wanted people to admire him. He wanted the company to look bigger, more influential, more prestigious than reality suggested. And now, the one public page that probably mattered most to his ego was hanging by a thread. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then a tiny, mischievous idea entered my mind. It wasn't illegal, it wasn't dishonest, it wasn't even really an attack, it was simply letting Wikipedia's own rules do exactly what they were designed to do. I moved my cursor toward the edit button. For the first time since that disastrous interview years earlier, I smiled. I wish I could tell you I spent weeks plotting some elaborate revenge. I didn't. There were no fake reviews, no angry emails, no social media campaign, no anonymous complaints. In fact, what happened next took less than 5 minutes. I clicked into the article and carefully read the notice at the top one more time. Wikipedia wasn't saying the company had done anything wrong. It wasn't accusing anyone of fraud. It was simply asking a question: does this company actually meet our standards for having its own page? The more I read the guidelines, the clearer it became. Wikipedia isn't meant to be free advertising. Companies don't automatically deserve an article just because they exist. They have to be notable enough to earn one through significant, independent coverage from reliable sources. This company didn't seem to have that. If it had, the article wouldn't have been hanging by a thread. Then I noticed another option available to editors: proposed deletion. The explanation was simple. If an article clearly didn't meet the requirements, an editor could add a proposed deletion tag. After that, anyone who disagreed had 7 days to object, improve the article, or remove the tag with a valid reason. If nobody did, the page would simply disappear. I leaned back in my chair. Part of me laughed at how unbelievably small this revenge would be. Another part remembered sitting in that lobby for an hour, remembered the dismissive tone, the pointless questions, the smug smile. The feeling of walking out wondering why I'd been treated like my time didn't matter. Maybe it was petty, actually, it was definitely petty, but it also followed every rule. I wasn't inventing anything. I wasn't vandalizing the article. I wasn't lying. I was simply starting a process that already existed. If the company truly deserved a Wikipedia page, someone would surely step in to save it. Right? I hovered my mouse over the button for a second, then I clicked. The deletion notice appeared at the top of the article. That was it, no dramatic music, no fireworks, no evil laugh, just one small edit. I closed the browser and went back to my evening. Honestly, I forgot about it almost immediately. The next day, I remembered and checked the page. Still there, the deletion notice remained. No changes, day 2, nothing, day 3, silence. I found myself becoming strangely invested. Surely someone from the company would notice, maybe the CEO himself. After all, judging by the article's history, someone had clearly cared enough to keep polishing it every time another editor removed the promotional language. This had to be important to them. Day 4, still untouched. By day 5, I couldn't stop smiling. It was almost unbelievable. If that Wikipedia page mattered as much as I suspected, why wasn't anyone paying attention? Had they forgotten it existed? Had the person maintaining it left the company? Or was nobody willing to defend it because there simply wasn't enough evidence that the company belonged there in the first place? By the 6th day, I checked the article before work, during lunch, and again before bed. Nothing, no objections, no improvements, no comments. Just that quiet little deletion notice waiting for the clock to run out. Then came day 7. I opened Wikipedia with my morning coffee. For a brief second, I felt oddly nervous. I typed in the company's name, search, instead of the familiar article. There was nothing. I refreshed the page, still nothing. The article was gone, deleted completely. I actually laughed out loud, not because I'd ruined anyone's business. Let's be honest, a missing Wikipedia page isn't going to destroy a company. But because the one thing that CEO seemed to value above everything else, his carefully crafted image, had quietly slipped away without anyone even bothering to defend it. There was something wonderfully poetic about that. The interview had lasted only 10 minutes, my revenge had taken less than 5, and 7 days later it was over. The whole thing gave me a tiny rush of satisfaction, not because it changed the world, not because it made me rich. Simply because, for once, someone who treated other people as if they didn't matter discovered that sometimes the smallest actions can have consequences. Call it karma, call it pettiness. Call it following the rules exactly as they were written, whatever you call it. I slept incredibly well that night. For a few minutes, I just sat there staring at the empty search results. It wasn't some dramatic movie-style victory. There were no angry phone calls, no furious emails. The CEO never found out it was me, at least not as far as I know. And honestly, that was part of what made it so satisfying. The entire experience reminded me of something I've believed ever since. The people who treat others with respect rarely have to spend their lives protecting their reputations. The people who don't usually end up creating their own problems. That interview could have gone very differently if he'd apologized for keeping me waiting an hour. If he'd spent 5 minutes reading my resume beforehand. If he'd asked thoughtful questions instead of fishing for gossip about my former coworkers. If he'd treated me like a human being instead of another inconvenience, I probably would have forgotten his name within a week. Instead, years later, I still remembered exactly how that office made me feel. Disrespect has a funny way of sticking with people. What really surprised me, though, wasn't deleting the page. It was realizing that nobody came to save it. Not an employee, not a loyal customer, not an enthusiastic supporter. No one stepped forward with the kind of reliable, independent information Wikipedia requires to justify keeping an article alive. That, more than anything else, said something about the company. A reputation can't be manufactured forever. Eventually, reality catches up. Looking back now, I don't pretend my little act of revenge changed anyone's life. The company almost certainly kept operating. The CEO probably continued acting exactly as he always had. And that's okay. Not every act of revenge has to be life-changing to feel satisfying. Sometimes the sweetest victories are the quiet ones, the ones that don't involve breaking rules, hurting people, or stooping to someone else's level. Sometimes justice is simply allowing a system to work exactly as it was designed to. One last thing still makes me laugh. When I originally shared this story online, I noticed people started downvoting it, quite a few of them. I remember staring at the screen thinking, really? Why? Maybe some people thought it was too petty. Maybe they believed I should have just let it go. Or maybe this is my favorite theory. The CEO somehow found the post and wasn't thrilled to relive the memory. I'll never know, and honestly, I don't really care. Because every time I remember that interview, I also remember opening Wikipedia 7 days later, searching for that company and finding absolutely nothing. Just an empty search result where a carefully polished piece of self-promotion used to be. It was a tiny moment, a tiny victory, but after the way I'd been treated, it felt just right. Maybe the real lesson here isn't about revenge at all. Maybe it's this: treat people with basic respect. You never know who will remember how you made them feel. And sometimes the smallest choices echo much longer than you expect. If this story made you smile or reminded you of someone who thought they were untouchable, let us know in the comments. What's the pettiest but most satisfying act of karma you've ever seen? If you enjoyed this Reddit revenge story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another unbelievable tale of instant karma, workplace drama, and perfectly executed petty revenge. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.